This isn't about little dolls. It's about a miniature house that showed everything terrible that was coming. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We're talking tonight about things you should never bring home, especially if they look like toys. This is the story of Sarah and Mark, a young couple who thought they found a perfect antique dollhouse. They thought it was cute, maybe worth some money later on. They had no idea it was a perfect, tiny map of their own coming destruction. Pay attention to the miniature windows because the darkness starts small. Sarah and Mark found the dollhouse at an estate sale just outside of Tulsa. It was a beautiful thing, made by hand, maybe 100 years old. Every detail was perfect, down to the tiny brass door knockers. It stood maybe 3 feet tall, and Sarah put it in the spare room. She didn't even have kids yet, but she loved the craftsmanship. The first odd thing happened the next day. Mark was getting coffee, and Sarah was dusting the little parlor inside the dollhouse. She looked at the miniature living room. Then she glanced at their actual living room. A tall, empty glass stood on their coffee table. But in the dollhouse, the tiny version of the glass was knocked over. The mini rug under it looked stained, dark brown, like spilled coffee. Sarah laughed it off. Just a weird coincidence. But that evening, Mark knocked over his coffee right there on the rug. The exact spot, the same dark stain. It soaked right into the carpet. They cleaned it up, but Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. The next week, she was looking at the dollhouse's kitchen. She saw the tiny refrigerator door was open in the miniature house. She found that odd, since she had shut all the doors the day before. Later that day, their actual refrigerator broke. The motor died completely, leaving the door slightly ajar, just like in the model. This pattern kept repeating. The dollhouse showed small, bad things before they happened. A cracked window in the tiny study meant a week later, a rogue baseball shattered their own study window. A small scorch mark on the dollhouse's roof meant their neighbor's old oak tree got hit by lightning and scraped their shingles. It was always bad news, always small. Mark tried to rationalize it. He said it was priming. Sarah saw the broken thing in the dollhouse, and maybe she subconsciously caused it to happen in real life. But the glass of coffee? He spilled that one himself. The mini-house started showing bigger things. One morning, Sarah looked at the tiny master bedroom. The miniature bed was empty, but there was a small, crudely drawn stick figure standing right next to the bed. It was dark, like a shadow. That night, Sarah woke up. She felt a weight at the end of the bed, right where the stick figure had been. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The air felt thick, like she was drowning in mud. She just heard heavy, ragged breathing that wasn't Mark's. She lay there, paralyzed, until the sunlight hit the windows. Then the weight was gone. Mark didn't believe her. He told her she had a nightmare. But Sarah checked the dollhouse. The miniature stick figure was gone. Instead, there was a small scratch mark on the tiny wooden floor next to the bed. The fear became constant. Sarah started spending hours just watching the dollhouse, trying to decode the terrible little warnings. It was like living on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to break. The next big change happened in the dollhouse attic. She had never opened the attic door before. It was stiff. When she finally got it open, the tiny room inside was completely dark, unlike the rest of the house. And in the center of the dark floor was a minuscule, white, plastic figure. It looked like a very small child. Sarah was terrified. They weren't trying for kids yet. She tried to take the figure out, but it was glued down. She called Mark home from work. He saw the figure and felt the dread for the first time. It felt wrong, heavy. They agreed to just get rid of it. They boxed it up right then and decided to take it to the dumpster outside the city limits. As Mark carried the taped-up box down the stairs, Sarah looked back at the spare room. She saw the spot where the dollhouse had stood. Then she looked at the miniature version of the spare room in her mind like a negative image, and she saw the tiny stairs. In the dollhouse's miniature staircase, a tiny Mark figure was tumbling down. The figure was bent at a bad angle. Before she could scream, she heard the crash from the bottom of their real staircase. It was the sound of heavy wood and a man hitting the floor, all at once. Sarah rushed down. Mark was lying there, the box beside him, broken open. The dollhouse was unharmed, looking perfectly fine. Mark wasn't. His neck was twisted in a way that defied nature. The police called it a tragic accident. They never questioned the dollhouse. After the funeral, Sarah couldn't stand the house. She couldn't look at the furniture that had been so perfectly copied in wood and brass. She sold the place and moved across the state. She never brought the dollhouse. She didn't know what happened to it. She tried not to think about it. Years later, she was living alone, finally feeling safe. One morning, she saw something small in the corner of her new kitchen, a tiny, perfect miniature. It was a single, tiny, antique chair. It wasn't there when she went to bed. She slowly looked around the rest of the room. She looked at the full-size kitchen table, and right on top of the table, perfectly centered, was the whole dollhouse. It wasn't the box she had left behind. It was smaller now, maybe just 18 inches high, but every detail was still perfect. Sarah walked closer, shaking. She looked through the tiny window of the miniature house. Inside, the master bedroom was set up. There was a tiny Mark figure, still bent at a bad angle on the floor. And next to him, sitting on the bed, was the miniature figure of a woman, a figure that looked exactly like Sarah. The miniature Sarah figure wasn't doing anything. She was just sitting there, waiting, looking right back out the tiny window. The things we take home sometimes carry more than just history. Sometimes they carry a future that was never meant to be ours. Sarah is still out there somewhere, but she never looks at a window after dark. You have to wonder what this small house is showing her now, and what terrible things are still waiting for her to happen. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more tales of things that should stay buried. Everyone remembers their childhood, right? Not in Oak Haven. There, the adults grew up, but the children never stayed. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight we're driving deep into the Midwest to a place called Oak Haven, Indiana. It's a quiet, friendly town known for its cornfields and its old wooden gazebo. But Oak Haven has a terrible secret, a ghost story that walks around in daylight. It's a town full of adults who never see a single kid. And if you listen closely, you'll find out why the lack of noise is the scariest part of all. Thomas was a traveling salesman, selling specialty farming equipment. He needed a place to stop for the night and saw the sign for Oak Haven. It looked perfect, just the sort of small, neat place where he could get a decent plate of food and a cheap motel room. When he drove into the town, everything looked good. Neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted fences, American flags hanging straight. But Thomas started to notice things that didn't fit. The schoolyard was spotless, but the swings were still. The baseball diamond was perfectly lined, but the grass was long on the bases. There were no bright yellow signs warning drivers to slow down for children crossing. He stopped at the town's only diner, the Acorn. The place was busy, filled with men and women talking quietly over coffee. He ordered a burger and watched the street. He watched for 20 minutes. No one ran down the sidewalk. No bicycles lay on their sides near the curb. There were no strollers, no kids arguing in the booths, and no high chairs anywhere. Thomas finally asked the waitress, a kind-looking woman named Doris, where all the kids were. Doris froze. The air in the diner went completely still. Every person stopped chewing, stopped sipping, and turned to look at Thomas. The silence was heavy, like a wool blanket had been thrown over the room. Doris finally forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said, "Oh, we're an older community here, sir. Quiet folk." She walked away fast. Thomas felt a spike of dread. This wasn't just an older community. This was unnatural. He finished his burger quickly and paid. He drove to the motel. The owner, a thin, nervous man, didn't ask Thomas to sign the register. He just handed him a heavy, old key and pointed to room 4. Thomas asked the owner, "Has there always been this quiet feel here?" The owner looked over his shoulder before answering. "If you see anything that doesn't belong here, Mr. Dot, just keep walking. Don't look behind you. And don't talk to anyone after the streetlights come on." Thomas went to his room. It was clean but smelled strongly of dust and old wood. He tried to watch TV, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. He pulled back the curtains and looked out at the parking lot. A few cars sat under the yellow streetlights. And then he saw it. It was a small plastic tricycle, bright red and blue. It was sitting right in the middle of the parking lot, completely alone. It looked brand new, shiny. Thomas felt relief. "See, there are children here. I was just being paranoid." He was just about to close the curtain when the tricycle started moving. It wasn't being ridden. It just tipped slowly onto its side, like an invisible hand had pushed it. It made a loud, scraping sound on the asphalt, too loud for a small toy. And then the sound stopped, completely cut off. Thomas stayed away from the window until morning. The next day, he drove out to the edge of town where the old abandoned church stood. It was famous for being the oldest structure in the county. He thought he would take a picture for his wife. As he walked up to the church, he noticed the small graveyard. The stones were old, many of them too worn to read. But as he looked closer, he saw that every single stone had the exact same year of death, 1888, and every single stone marked the grave of a child. Small names: Lily, David, Samuel, Alice, dozens of them. He realized what the town knew. They weren't an older community. They were a cursed community. Something had taken the children generations ago, and it still claimed whatever came next. He heard a low humming sound coming from inside the church. It sounded like a child's toy, a music box, playing a sad, slow tune. He turned to leave, but he saw a flash of movement in the church's small, cracked window. It was just the outline of a face, small, with wide, dark eyes. It looked like a child watching him. Thomas panicked and ran back to his car. He didn't look behind him. He didn't want to see what was watching from the church window or what might be standing near the empty graves. He sped through Oak Haven, not stopping. As he passed the town limit sign, he looked in his rearview mirror. The town was suddenly dark, even though it was midday. The clean, neat houses looked collapsed and gray. The streets were filled with a thick, yellowish fog. And then he saw them, dozens of them. Small, shadowy figures standing in the road, their faces turned toward him. They weren't running or chasing. They were just standing, watching him leave. They were the children who had never been allowed to grow up. Thomas never drove back that way. He quit his job and took a different route entirely. He sometimes wonders what happens when an Oak Haven couple has a baby. Does it just disappear in the night? Or does it grow up only to forget that it ever had a child of its own? He stopped wondering when he came home one evening and found a small, old wooden block sitting on his pillow. The block had one word carved into it, Lily. He didn't have any children. Some places hold their darkness deep, keeping secrets that shouldn't be shared. Oak Haven keeps its silence, and sometimes the quietest places are the most haunted. Remember what the motel owner said. Don't look behind you. Maybe those shadowy children are closer than you think. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more unsettling tales. This vintage camera didn't capture light. It captured the shadows that stand just out of sight. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We're talking about an obsession tonight, a man named David who collected old cameras. This is the story of the one camera he found that didn't just take pictures of the past, but showed him who was waiting for him in the present. If you ever find an antique camera, check the lens for dust, but mostly, check what stares back when you develop the film. David was a collector, specifically of pre-war photography gear. He loved the smell of old leather and developing chemicals. He spent a fortune on auctions and estate sales. One Saturday, he found a camera in a junk shop in rural Oregon. It was a heavy, boxy thing, a 1920s model, wrapped in cracked black leather. It felt cold to the touch, even though the day was warm. The owner of the shop, a grumpy old man, practically gave it away. "Don't bother with the film," the man said, looking down. "It doesn't take good pictures." Too dark. David ignored the warning. He cleaned the camera up, loaded it with fresh black and white film, and decided to test it out. His first shot was of his own living room. He wanted a baseline, a normal picture of a normal, sunny space. He took the picture and waited eagerly for the developing process. When the print came out, David stared at it. The living room was perfectly captured, the fireplace, the rug, the window with sunlight pouring in. But standing right behind his favorite armchair was a figure. It was a woman dressed in a long, dark 19th century dress. Her face was blurry, maybe from movement, but her posture was rigid, like she was posing. David lived alone. He knew that chair was empty when he took the photo. He checked the room again, looking behind the chair, feeling the velvet, expecting some trick of the light. Nothing. He thought maybe the film was old, or the chemicals were bad. He tried again. He took a picture of his kitchen. When he developed the negative, the kitchen was normal. But sitting at his table, where he ate breakfast every morning, was an elderly man in suspenders and a bowler hat. The man looked sad, staring down at the empty table. David started to panic. This wasn't a double exposure. It wasn't a reflection. The images were too clear, too much a part of the scene. The camera was showing him people who weren't there. He realized the camera wasn't just taking pictures. It was taking pictures of ghosts. The fear quickly turned into a strange, morbid curiosity. He started using the camera everywhere. He'd walk through the city park, snap a picture, and later see a whole group of pale, silent figures sitting on benches that were empty in real life. He saw a man leaning against a lamppost where nothing stood but metal. The entities never seemed to notice him or the camera. They were just part of the landscape, like faint, dark graffiti. The terrifying change came when he took a picture of his bedroom wall. He wanted to see what kind of entity might share his sleeping space. When the image developed, the wall looked slightly wavy. The plaster seemed to be sagging. And carved into the wall, where there was only smooth paint in reality, were hundreds of tiny, cramped names. All old-fashioned names. But the most disturbing detail was a face. It wasn't a whole body, just a face pressed against the plaster from the inside. The eyes were closed, and the mouth was wide open in a silent scream. The image was grainy, but the horror was crystal clear. David stopped sleeping in that room. He started avoiding the camera, wrapping it up and putting it in his attic, but the images had infected his mind. He couldn't look at a wall without wondering what unseen things were struggling behind the paint. 1 week later, David was downstairs watching television. He heard a noise from the attic, a faint rhythmic scraping sound, like dry fingernails dragging across wood. He went upstairs, terrified, knowing it had something to do with the camera. The attic door was shut, but the scraping was loud now, coming from inside. It sounded like something was trying to push through the floorboards. David called the police. When they arrived, he explained everything, leaving out the part about the camera and the ghosts. He just told them he heard intruders in his house. The police searched the attic. They found nothing. No footprints, no broken locks, no signs of entry. The only thing they found was the old black camera sitting unwrapped on the floor. It had film inside. The police officer, a young guy named Officer Miller, took a picture of the dusty attic with the strange camera, just to show David it was probably the wind. Later, David saw the photo they developed at the station. It showed the attic clearly, and behind Officer Miller, who was smiling at the camera, was David. But the photographed David wasn't standing upright. He was trapped, halfway inside the attic wall, his body covered in thick plaster. Only his head and shoulders were sticking out, and his face was frozen in the same silent, screaming horror David had seen on the first wall photo. The officer laughed and said the camera must be broken, making double exposures. He handed the photo to David, who took it and walked out. David went home, knowing what was coming. He knew the camera hadn't taken a picture of the past or the future. It had taken a picture of the process. He locked the front door. He went to his bedroom, the one with the cramped names in the picture. The wall looked normal, but he could hear the faint, muffled scraping again, closer this time, just behind the plaster. The walls were breathing. He looked at the picture one last time, seeing his own face trapped in the plaster. He tossed the picture onto his bed. Then, from the spot where his head was trapped in the photo, a section of the wall pushed out, just a little. Not breaking through yet, but bulging, like a knot. David didn't run. He just stood there, waiting for the camera's final picture to come true. Because he knew that whatever was taking these pictures was waiting on the other side of that wall, and it wanted company. The things we collect are rarely just objects. Sometimes they are traps, built to bring the unseen world right into our homes. That old camera is still out there somewhere, ready for the next person to load the film. You just have to wonder who or what it will capture next. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more things that go bump in the night.